Hi, everyone. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative here at the Atlantic Council. When I started working on Iran for the Council more than a decade ago, my activities were under the South Asia Center, the first dedicated geographical program created by the Council after years of focusing on transatlantic relations. So it is with particular pleasure that I host this event now, which is co-sponsored by the South Asia Center and our Middle East programs. Now, we all know that the war in Ukraine is taking up a lot of diplomatic oxygen, but I think it's important to remember that only a few months ago, the crisis du jour was Afghanistan, the U.S. withdrawal after 20 years of war, and the abrupt takeover of Kabul and much of the country by the Taliban. Now, Americans were not the only people horrified by the Taliban's return. Afghanistan's neighbors were also severely affected, and that very much includes Iran. So we are pleased today to discuss Iran's concerns with Afghanistan and vice versa. These are explored in a new paper by Borzu Daragahi, a veteran journalist who's covered the region extensively for decades and who we are very lucky to have as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. We're also going to be joined by a longtime friend and former senior fellow, Fatimiyoun, who is now at the Middle East Institute, which is our loss. Fatima has written on Iran, Afghanistan, and broader Middle Eastern affairs for over 25 years for outlets including Jane's Islamic Affairs Analyst and Jane's Intelligence Review. And she was also a writer, producer, and anchor at Voice of America and a correspondent with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And finally, we have Dr. Niloufar Sahi, a professorial lecturer of international affairs at the Elliott School at George Washington University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. Previously, she taught at the Foreign Service Institute, and she directed policy and diplomacy at McComb and Company. She's written extensively on traditional and non-traditional security, peacemaking, and peace building. And her most recent book is Human Security and Agency: Reframing Productive Power in Afghanistan. So I invite you to watch our panel. Also, please check out the issue brief, which is on the Atlantic Council website. And as we go along in today's event, if you have questions, and we encourage you to have questions, put them in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we will get to them as soon as we can. So we're going to start with Borzu. Borzu, how bad is it in Afghanistan? And is there, again, a convergence of interest between the United States, Iran, and other countries about stabilizing the country, helping on the humanitarian front, and countering extremism?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thanks for all the hard work that went into this this paper. I was really flattered. Someone in the green room, professor of Afghanistan studies, of Afghan origin, said that the report was very comprehensive. That's not just my work; that's the work of the editors at the Atlantic Council, including yourself, Barbara. Who, you know, we took our time with this. We put a lot of it went on for a while. And I guess I just wanted to say, before I address the questions, just to set the sort of broader context. And in a way, it was sort of the impetus for this whole project. Afghanistan is just such a terrible, what has happened in Afghanistan over the past year is such a terrible tragedy, first and foremost, for the Afghan people. And the levels of despair and injustice and imbalance in that country right now are in some ways incomparable to anything else going on. And it would be such a shame and disaster for the world and the region and for the Afghan people if Afghanistan were again to become a territory for great power or even regional power competition and rivalry and hostility. And I think that, you know, interestingly enough, I think that most of the countries in the region kind of recognize that. And in that sense, there is first of all, there is, having watched the US and Russia and, you know, more in the past, Britain and other world powers, including, you know, a couple centuries ago, Iran, being bitten very badly by trying to dominate Afghanistan and being the power there, I think that everyone is very cautious and careful and diplomatic. As I write in this paper, unlike America or the West, there's no easy slogans that can be written on a Tehran wall that can solve the Afghan issue for Iran. There's no upside for exploiting the situation there. And I think that in that sense, that is the kind of ground that we begin with. The situation in a way creates an opportunity that can be a meager win-win-win for everyone. It is an opportunity for Iranians to contribute to the stabilization of Afghanistan, and in that sense, contribute to its own stability. And we sketch out in the paper what Iran's fears are and what the stability threats are that emanate from Afghanistan toward Iran. It is an opportunity for the United States to not only seek a more humane outcome in Afghanistan, because really there's no good outcome at this point, given the takeover by this particular group and the dissolution of the democratic aspirations of the Afghan people. Not only kind of get a less awful outcome, but also potentially reinforce modestly some Iranian good behaviors in the region, so that it's, even if the JCPOA collapses or ultimately ends up doing nothing much, at the very least there is some kind of, I don't want to say good diplomatic relations, but some kind of diplomatic possibilities between the U.S. and this new hardline administration in Afghanistan. And with that, I will give it back. I think that's a pretty good summary, and I'm more about questions than going on and on. So I appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing what the others have to say.
Thank you, Boris. You're spoken like a true journalist who wants the questions and doesn't want to give the answers. But I think you're a bit too modest. And maybe I'll just ask you one quick follow-up before we turn to the others. And that is, you mentioned this sort of possibility for a meager win-win. Just remind folks of the history of U.S. Iran interaction over Afghanistan before September 11th, 2001, and then after, because that certainly was an interesting period. If you could remind people what the 6+2 was, and how that actually became a venue for U.S. Iran conversations when most people didn't know about it, I think that would be helpful.
Absolutely, and I assume that the mostly scholarly people who are listening in have a little bit of background, but there was interestingly, during the period, the previous period of Taliban rule, there was something like a coalition against the Taliban that included Iran, and the U.S. was out of the picture at that point, mostly. We're talking about the 90s. And this organized armed opposition to the Taliban after September 11th became the next government. And this was the so-called Northern Alliance. And the various fragments and elements of the Northern Alliance became the Afghan government and its offshoots and permutations and so on. And key to remember is that in the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and the toppling of the Taliban, Iran played a very constructive role as far as the U.S. was concerned, allowing the U.S. to consider Iran a kind of a strategic area in case any of its pilots got into trouble, facilitating the movement of humanitarian goods and possibly even, military goods and so on. There was tacit cooperation during that time. And then after that situation was somewhat stabilized, in the minds of the Iranians, the U.S. stabbed Iran in the back. It denoted Iran as part of the axis of evil. Iran watchers will know that this was a almost sentencing, the genuine and rather at that point momentum building reform movement in Iran. It was almost a death sentence for that faction. And it brought about a kind of dynamic that shifted Iran further to the right and so on, and gave the upper hand. So in a way, that was kind of a very momentous decision on the part of the Bush II administration. So despite the diplomatic cooperation that took place during that time period, no decent outcome came out of Afghanistan as far as Iran-U.S. relations.
All right, let's turn now, if we may, to Fatima. Fatima, talk about how Iranians are now regarding the situation in Afghanistan, but particularly the refugee situation. Now, obviously, the economic crisis in Iran is not as bad as it is in Afghanistan, but it's not good. We've seen a lot of protests recently. Is there a danger that Afghan refugees in Iran, and there are millions of them, that they could become scapegoats somehow? How do you see their position now in the country, and what are your concerns about their safety? And you have to unmute.
Sure. Yeah, let me just thank you and the Atlantic Council for having me on this great and very timely event. I really appreciate that. There is definitely possibility and that Afghan refugees become scapegoats. In many parts of the world, governments, use migrants or refugees as an excuse to justify their own failures and shortcomings. So that we have seen that in Europe, in the United States, and in many other parts of the world, including Iran. Afghans, especially poor Afghans, and specifically defenseless, undocumented Afghans, have been blamed for almost everything, from increasing crime rates to higher prices of, as you just mentioned, housing crisis and even water shortage. This is a bizarre story, but let me just mention a representative of the parliament from the city of Torbat Haydariye several years ago said that there are 4 million Afghan refugees in Iran. If each of them uses 100 liters of water on daily basis, so that means Afghans living in Iran use 400 million liters of water. You see, I mean, that sometimes comes to bizarre things like that, but they are exaggeration about the number of Afghan refugees in Iran. Now the conservative, even Amir Abdullahian, foreign minister, just claimed that 5 million Afghans entered Iran since Taliban takeover, and other conservative media go even further, claiming that 8 million Afghan refugees have entered Iran since Taliban seized power. These numbers are highly exaggerated and totally unrealistic, and do not include the number of refugees who have been deported from Iran, or those who leave Iran because of the worsening economic situation. So I just recently told a EU commissioner that one of the EU commissions that Iran should be monitored about the situation of Afghan refugees in Iran should be monitored, and Iran should be helped actually, to deal with the crisis, and it should include even financial support if it's needed, and no country, nor Europe or not the United States, can be exempt from getting involved. I mean, it's not like, okay, Afghanistan was our issue, that's for the past, now we have different issues. You can't just leave Afghanistan to the way it is. It's really a collective responsibility, you know, and not just an issue of the neighboring countries.
Let me ask you about external support, because I remember in the 1990s when I used to go to Iran, and of course there were a lot of refugees there at the time. I think Iran had at least 2 million refugees or 3 million refugees from Afghanistan in the 90s. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees did provide some support for Iran to deal with these people at the time. Is the UN not giving support to Iran now?
They are, but we have to remember that everything happened in a very short time, you know, and no one expected the Taliban to come to power the way they did. You know, there were no real preparation for that. And in the beginning, they announced that they have set up camps near the border for the refugees. Then they denied existence of those camps, you know, fearing that that would encourage more people to come. They started, you know, sending back whoever would cross the border if they didn't have the proper paper. You know, the High Commissioner for the Refugees, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, says that they are, you know, in 2021, about 500,000 Afghans entered Iran. So the number we see, the number is very different from what the conservatives claim in Iran. They are support, but as I mentioned, both the number, because of the number, and the amount of time that was short, you know, too short for all these events and changes. So they obviously need more time, and then they faced with the increasing dissatisfaction, you know, in Iran, all these demonstrations, protests, and they definitely need somebody to blame, you know, and who is more suitable than defenseless refugees.
Indeed, indeed. Let me ask you also about the kinds of people who are coming into Iran. And Borzu wrote about this in his paper, that it's not just Shia Afghans or Dari-speaking Afghans, but we actually have folks who in other days might have gone to Pakistan instead, Sunni Muslims, Pashto-speaking Afghans, and concerns about unrest and violence connected to sectarian issues. I believe that recently several Shia clerics in Mashhad were killed by what was purported to be an Afghan Sunni fundamentalist.
You know, that's true. As I mentioned, the reason that, you know, the people, Afghans didn't have to choose between going to Pakistan or to Iran was the, you know, the speed of these changes. Whoever was closer to any border, they would just leave and go to that country. And remember that I read Borzu's wonderful, amazing report. I truly enjoyed, you know, reading that. And he mentions the possibility of the, you know, sectarian conflict of Afghans in Iran. But we also have to mention that the Islamic Republic, you know, has experience in dealing with the with Sunnis, for instance. Hekmatyar was very well, you know, hosted when he was there. Ismail Khan is not a Shia, and they have been. The number really goes out of control, and if things change, it's a political events in Iran goes south. Who knows? That could also add to the numerous issues that the government has at this point.
Okay, Niloufar, let me turn to you now, and I'd like your comments on Borzu's paper, and maybe if you could give us some background on how the Iranians and Afghans have been interacting during the period when there were talks going on in Doha and so on. how was Iran supporting or not supporting those talks? And how does Iran view the Taliban now, and how does the Taliban view Iran?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for having me here. It is great to be among such a wonderful panelist. Thank you so much, Borzo, for writing such a comprehensive paper. I think you captured all the areas of concern and the threats that Iran faces right now, and also the relationship between these two countries. So a wonderful work. Thank you for that. As you asked, let me give you a little bit background. As Borzo mentioned, it was a tragedy. The Taliban takeover was a tragedy for Afghanistan, was a tragedy for the region as well. With the Taliban regime, there are security concerns that most of these neighboring countries, I mean, all the neighboring countries are really concerned about. And why? Because, of course, there's lack of clarity between the different factions of the Taliban at this point. The presence of Al-Qaeda, close ties between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and the emergence of newly emerged terrorist and insurgent groups across the country. They are the concerns that these regional countries, neighbors in particular, have raised since the Taliban takeover, particularly from last few months, like 4 to 5 months, 3 to 4 months, because of the rise of different kinds of insecurity in Afghanistan. A number of attacks have been on rise, and then attacks against Shia communities, minorities. So there were concerns that Iran has raised that from last few months. And I think if it's going to increase, that will be a major point for Iran to take it into serious consideration. Now, the relationship, as going back to your question, the relationship between Iran and Taliban has been rocky and shaky from Taliban's previous regime as well. In 1998, when the Taliban were controlling most of Afghanistan, they killed Iranian diplomatic personnel, and an Iranian journalist in the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif, which made Iran close to a military response. So that was kind of a very hostile relationship between these two entities, Taliban and Iran and Tehran. And also that also created a kind of hostile feelings among the people of Iran against the Taliban. Then also in 2001, Tehran actively supported the U.S. in ousting the Taliban and setting up a new government in Kabul. And then from 2010 onwards, Tehran started linking with different factions of the Taliban as Taliban gained power in certain part of the countries, especially the border areas. So I think if we go back to 2010, we have seen that there has been a kind of relationship between the Taliban and Iran. In 2019, when the Doha Agreement was signed, 2020, 29 February 2020, when the Doha Agreement was signed, there was a general perception among officials in Tehran that the next power would be Taliban. Therefore, Tehran hosted a first event of Taliban leadership and giving them a stage. Of course, because they were in the same belief that the next power would be the Taliban, and isolating ourselves, Iran, as it perceived, isolating Iran would be would create a security crisis for Iran. So building relationship with the Taliban would be a wise move for Tehran at that particular time. So therefore, there has been a back and forth kind of a coordination and cooperation between the Taliban and Tehran since the Taliban takeover. Now, where they stand now and what it means for both for Iran and the Taliban. But for Iran, its national security is a priority. And for Iran, as I mentioned, the relationship has been shaky and rocky. It could again turn into a different format. if there will be sectarian conflict in Afghanistan, if Taliban continue attacking or continue neglecting these minorities, especially Shia community, if there will be atrocities against Shia and Hazaras, I think that would change the relationship between Tehran and Iran. And if Taliban fail to control the country, and if Taliban fail to protect the security of the borders. So that would be a different scenario. That would be a very hard kind of a relationship between these two entities. But if, as Iran has mentioned, that the inclusive government or all other conditions that Iran has been mentioning so far, if that would be a respect for minorities, respect for the Shias and all others, so that would create close ties between the two entities. As Iran, I think as it was mentioned before, Iran is looking also at Afghanistan from a different lens, from a lens of opportunity, to expand its trade and accessibility to Central Asian market. So for Iran, I think it's a very strategic policy move to have a better relationship with the Taliban rather than a hostile relationship with the Taliban. Therefore, I think I would see that they will going forward, they will try all their means. Iran will try all their means to build a closer relationship with the Taliban, who are now controlling Afghanistan. From Taliban lens, well, Taliban are kind of looking at Iran as a model of governance.
Oh dear.
For themselves. Yeah, that's unfortunate, but they are kind of looking at them. I mean, I was just watching the news a day before about this a new moral policing that Taliban have created in Kabul and all around in different provinces. It's kind of similar to what initially it was launched when mullahs were in power in Iran. They started doing the same moral policing that Taliban are kind of implementing now. So it seems that they are kind of looking at Iran as a model of governance, as a model of implementing a strict Islamic rule on the population in the country. And on the other hand, I think the leadership of the Taliban, as they have been very vocal about it, that they want to build relationship with all the neighboring countries for many reasons, of course, because they need support. They want money and they want resources. On the other hand, they want recognition. And they are trying to work closely with the neighboring countries in order to convince them, or I think take steps towards recognition. That's also another intention of Taliban, to bring on board these neighboring countries on their goals towards recognition. And the funding opportunity, if it exists, to gain more from them. But I think the rest of the point already mentioned by Fatma, and beautifully written in Borzo paper about the threats that Iran faces from Afghanistan overall, which is a flow of refugee, of course. It's a volatility spillover into Iran. And of course, the targeting attacks against Shia and Hazara community that, and overall, as I mentioned, the security itself is a major concern. I stop here and get back to the question and answer.
All right, let me go maybe back to Borzu and Fatima as well. Iran has not recognized the Taliban regime formally, even though it obviously has a lot of interaction with it and has hosted Taliban officials. Why is that? Borzu.
I mean, the official reason is that they want a more inclusive government. They want to give some. They have some leverage, and that is one piece of leverage they have over the Taliban. They want a more inclusive government, and that it would be one that would include other political factions and other, substantive representation of other ethnic and sectarian communities in that government. But I also think that, like, no one has recognized the Taliban government. No one, and Iran is certainly not going to be the first country to make such a bold move. I think there is also, and I'd be interested to hear what Fatima has to say about this. I think there's still reverberations of strong disagreement within the regime between elements of the Revolutionary Guard and the more kind of traditional and normalized aspects of the national security administration, who do not want to, they're still split about this whole entity, how much of a relationship they should have, how much, to what extent the Taliban can be trusted to keep their word, and how close they want to get to this government. So definitely, they didn't recognize the Taliban government in the 90s, and they're not recognized it now. And they won't be the first to recognize the Taliban government.
Yeah, that's interesting. Fatima, do you have any thoughts on that? On what Iran is waiting for, what leverage, if any, it might have on the Taliban, and also the fact that the Taliban has turned out not to be able to consolidate control over the country in the way that many had expected, so that maybe that's one of the reasons why no one is jumping to formally endorse the regime. Fatima, can you unmute?
Yes, I forget. I'm sorry. Iran's support of the Taliban has always been associated with mistrust. Both Iran and the Taliban mistrust each other. Iran tried to increase its influence within the group by getting cozier to, say, to Hezb Velayat Islami, for instance, or a gentleman, Mullah Qayyum Zakir is also one of those figures close to Iran. But Iran knows that it cannot compete with Pakistan and some Arab rivals in being close enough to the Taliban. But I think they are cautious because, as all of you mentioned, there is another worst-case scenario for Iran and for many in the region: a full-scale civil war in Afghanistan that would bring back, would wake up all these sleeping cells, would reconnect extremists from different parts of the region. So Iran's coziness with the Taliban was based on the assumption that only the Taliban can defeat ISK, Islamic State Khorasan, and the Taliban would be the only group that could keep ISK away from Iran's borders. So far, as Nilüfer mentioned, the Taliban has not produced anything that was Iran had in mind. The religious minorities are at unbelievable level of violence, and it seems that the Taliban could not prevent infiltration of the terrorist-related groups into Iran, and they have not been successful in combating to overcome the other terrorist groups. And so there could have been, we will see actually if that was in fact a miscalculation of Iran's part to think that it can rely on the Taliban. But one way, just back to the refugees question, and one way to to prevent tragedies such as more terror attacks or killings in Iran by the elements infiltrated into Iran is to win the hearts and minds of the refugees, and to make their life a little easier. When you consider that, as Borzo mentioned in his report, only recently Iranian women married to Afghans can have can get citizenship for their kids, or just 2018 Supreme Leader's decree that allowed public schools, free public schools for all legal and illegal, documented and undocumented Afghans in Iran. But there are still so much that needs to be done, and it's really not fancy rights or something. It's something as simple as being able to get mobile SIM cards, being able to be included in healthcare or in some other basic rights. Basically, having a bank account, which is subject to fraud, and they are really they deserve a little. I mean, Iran should reconsider the way they are treating Afghan refugees in Iran.
That's a very important point. We have one of our first questions coming in from Alex Barker. He asks, and maybe I'll pass this to you, Nilüfer, said, given the Quds Force experience fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria, would the Taliban be interested in security assistance from Iran to deal with ISIS-K and the rebels in the Panjshir Valley? Do you think that's at all possible, or is that far-fetched?
Well, at this point, I don't see the possibility. Taliban are trying to showcase themselves as an independent organization. Even with their relationship with Pakistan, if we see, they have been very vocal about that, saying that, well, we are not a proxy of Pakistan. We are not closely working on them on issues of security anymore. And they have been very clear about that. So looking at that, and they have been cooperating a lot with these regional countries on humanitarian assistance and other packages, but not really security. So I don't see that as a short-term scenario with any security cooperation with Iran at this point. But again, if that complicates, if the situation will complicate and will challenge Taliban power, one could imagine that kind of security cooperation between Taliban and other entities in the region.
Let me ask you a little bit more about the humanitarian relief situation. We know that the United States has frozen, $7 billion in Taliban assets, and even offered their victims of 9/11 who are trying to get their hands on some of this money. But we do know that there is international humanitarian aid that has been coming in, I think, primarily through Uzbekistan. Just if you could give us a sense of how much international cooperation is involved in terms of providing this aid, how sufficient or insufficient. I've seen a lot of horrific footage of people in Afghanistan who are so desperate just for food that they go out and they collect unexploded munitions and risk their lives just to have scrap metal to sell. How bad is it, Nilüfer?
Well, it is bad. As UN highlighted, half of the population are in the dire need of food. And UN is one of the major actor and distributing humanitarian aid throughout the country, though there has been a lot of challenges with the UN distribution of humanitarian packages, as they had target distribution, not flat distribution of humanitarian packages. And that created a lot of concern because the packages, the humanitarian packages, food, and all the other basic needs, they were not reaching to the very remote areas of the country, to the villages, to the very far part of the country. And that was the concern, because those parts were actually in dire need of the basic health and basic food, and of course, so that remained a challenge. And of course, with issues such as there's no money inside the country in order to pay the public servants. So that is another major crisis that people are facing. So overall, the humanitarian situation, especially in the winter, it was the worst one. And people were dying, kids and infants were dying. There were a number of reports that, especially UN, WFP reports, that highlights the dire needs and dire situation of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. But again, UN is the leading organization and distributing, and they are distributing that through NGOs, through Afghan-led NGOs and humanitarian NGOs throughout the country. Now they started working also with the UN started working with some community development centers, which was initially in place in very remote areas. And the humanitarian packages are distributed through them because they have access to the very remote parts of the country. So seems it's kind of settling with the basic provision of basic needs only. But again, the salaries are not paid on time, the salaries of teachers, doctors, and all the public servants. And there's no extremely shrinking environment for job opportunities, because many of these international organizations, they packed up and they left. So lots and lots of unemployment in the country. So the country is still struggling a lot with this humanitarian crisis, and that is one which international community are trying to coordinate and cooperate more with the Taliban to address the humanitarian crisis. But again, there are also reports, by the way, Barbara, about injustices in the delivery of aid, like especially from the Taliban side too, because there are reports, again, the Taliban were controlling some of the aid packages and distributing to their own places and locations where they had their own people in support. So that was another report that I have been at least hearing and reading from different sources about injustices and distribution of aid through the hands of the Taliban.
Let me ask you one more that's just come in from one of our viewers. This is Agostino Bono from Italy. His question is about, I guess, differences of opinion within the Taliban, that there are some that may be flexible but are not in control, and whether this is exacerbating tensions within the Taliban regime, and whether even this government can stay politically cohesive. I think we all remember the promises that were made by some of the Taliban officials after they took power. And now all of a sudden we see that they're saying that young women can't go to school and women have to wear burqas. And it doesn't seem as though the more flexible faction has won out. What is your expectation for the cohesion of the actual Kabul government? Do you think that they'll stick together? And what happens to these folks who have been more relaxed, shall we say, about some of the Taliban ideology?
Well, I don't see a very positive scenarios coming out of the differences between these different factions of the Taliban. There are hardliners, and especially the Haqqani network within the Taliban are considered the hardliners, and then the Kandari party, which Mullah brother and his team, the negotiators in Doha, they are considered as moderates. And that's what it has been framed so far in the reports and people who meet them and talk to them and document their statements. And yes, there is no unity of ideology among different factions of the Taliban. I think it has been very clear from last 8 months about different policies that they wanted to put in place. We hear different things, for example, about hijab, about some their relationship with the neighboring countries even, and about the statements that they have said about the Pakistan and TTP, and many other issues that they had time to talk about. We have seen differences of views between and among the different factions. What I would, I predict, based on the dynamics of these groups from past as well, is there will be a split at some point between or among them. And like ISKP, which was kind of a split from them. So there will be a split, and the timing, don't ask me, I don't know when, right? But and because of the ideological differences and some power that they will be, of course, they will be fighting over power as well. So there will be at some point splits, and that splits will have will add another layer of insecurity in the country, because that will be either will work as an opposition to the main group who will be controlling the power in Kabul, or they will organize themselves into another group then. We have been seeing this from last 7 months, and also there are reports, by the way, Barbara, that's saying that some of the Taliban members, they don't want that split to happen. So they try their best to keep the group united, because that's at least at this particular time where they're looking for recognition, for money, and for support internationally. A split would really harm their power and their constituency. So therefore, their struggle is to keep at any cost, keep the group together and present a united face to the world.
Interesting. Borza, let me come back to you and talk about the Iran no longer really supports the Northern Alliance. There is no Northern Alliance in the sense that there was 20 years ago. But you have written in your paper that Iran does have in its back pocket a card to play, and perhaps a rather potent card to play, if there is a sense that it needs to intervene in some way militarily again in Afghanistan, the Fatimiyoun Brigades. Tell folks what this is, how many people are involved, where they're based now. Are they were in Syria, where are they now? And what could be the role of Fatimiyoun Brigades?
Yeah, I think this is a good, important question and a good juncture. Now we get to the sort of hardware of all of this and the real dangers here. And it goes back to a little bit that someone had a question about ISIS. In Syria, at least, Iran per se never really fought ISIS. It did in Iraq, but not through Iran. There was very little. A few Iranian officers and volunteers, advisors, and so on were involved in the fights in Syria and Iraq, but it was mostly through various militia groups. They're the ones who bore the brunt of the fighting. That includes Syrians. That included Iraqi militiamen fighting that were organized by the Iranian Quds Force and so on. And that included Afghans and some Pakistani Shia that were recruited through what would be called what would be similar to an Iranian Foreign Legion, a semi-clandestine expeditionary kind of force that Iran organized and used, and uses as a methodology that Iran has developed for having someone else fight its strategic battles. And as far as the Afghans were concerned, they were recruited from Iran, they were recruited from Afghanistan, and deployed to Syria, not to Iraq. And bore a lot of they suffered a lot. They were killed a lot. A lot of them were killed. They were at first not the most talented and coveted fighters, but having covered the Syria conflict for years and years and years, I could see the shift in attitude from the Syrian rebel side. From saying these guys are just kids in slippers that we easily kill, to saying, whoa, those Fatimiyoun guys are really good. They're getting really good, and they became rather hardened and dangerous to the.
For a sec, did Hezbollah train them? Who trained them?
Yeah, I mean, it's all. I mean, no. In the case of the Afghan fighters, it was Iranian. It's a language issue, right? So if they're, Arab guys, the Hezbollah will. If they're Yemeni or Iraqi, the Hezbollah guys will treat them. If they're, if they're Afghan, then the Iranian guys will train them. But in any case, none of these guys really wanted to keep doing this. They all, so to speak, took their pensions, and very few of them, let's say, continued on. They all took their pensions, they took their payments. This is my very strong understanding, and they went back to the Hazarajat or went back to Iranian cities and continued their lives and so on. Except for very few who became perhaps more passionate about fighting and got into it, and that has always been something that has been since the Taliban's rise. That has been something that has been dangled forth as a possibility. In fact, multiple sources, publicly even saying it, including former Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, said that they offered to use a Fatimiyoun. They offered to Ashraf Ghani's government to bring the Fatimiyoun, to get the band back together, so to speak, get the guys back, and deploy them on behalf of the Ashraf Ghani government against both the Taliban and ISIS. So this is a possibility that was presented quite vocally. It was presented by Ismail Qani, who was the head of the Quds force, and presented by other Iranians, publicly spoken about. The Afghan government, Ashraf Ghani, said, no, thank you. I think that would really upset the Americans if I did that, if I brought that here. But that is one way things could go very south in Afghanistan, is if Iran used let's say, and I've been watching for this. I would appreciate to hear what our Afghan scholar has to say about this. But I've been watching for this. I've not seen any evidence of harsh repression against Afghan Shia by the Taliban, any harsher than they are repressive against every other faction of society. I have not seen great evidence of that they're, the one of the things that really triggered Iran's interventions in the 90s was I don't know what else to call it, but ethnic cleansing of Hazara from central Afghanistan by the Taliban. There's nothing like that happening now. I don't read about it. I don't see it. I see fears of it, but I don't see evidence of that. But if that were to happen, I mean, this is one way Iran could respond, and this is one way things could go really south. And then the Pakistanis would intervene because the Iranians are intervening, and then who suffers in that situations? Afghan people. And their misery becomes even more. So that is one, real danger that is out there. It's not at this point, it's not a likelihood, because it looks like the Taliban is behaving on that sectarian issue, even though it's not welcoming the Hazara into the upper ranks of the administration of the country. It is not launching a near genocidal war against them either.
Let me go to Nilüfer on that, because while there may not be ethnic cleansing, there certainly have been horrible terrorist attacks on Hazara and no, I assume those are ISIS largely, and the problem is that that the Taliban can't provide security, or chooses not to provide security for Shia. So maybe Nilüfer, you touch that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Barbara. Yes, the attacks, the recent attacks on Shia community and Hazaras, there were a number of them, very deadly attacks happened from last couple of months. ISIS took claim for that. But then what the Hazara community were raising an issue that it's a kind of a genocide. That was they were labeling that as a genocide, because there were a series of attacks on the same sect, and then they put the blame was on the Taliban, because Taliban, as you mentioned, Barbara, failed to provide security to the Shia community and Shia populated areas in Kabul and around the country as well. So that again, the blame is on the Taliban. Why? Because there's an institutional memory that Hazaras have from 1990s, where there was serious atrocities against Shia community and Hazaras when they were in power, and that's a fair now. And in terms of the policy, or the attitude of the Taliban towards the minorities, yes, there hasn't been a very concrete action or steps that we can name it as a ethnic cleansing coming from their regime. I mean, from them. from last few months. But again, look at the composition of the interim government. As Borzo mentioned, I mean, we don't see any Hazaras, Shia, or Tajiks also in the high-ranking and mid-ranking even positions of their government. So there is, I mean, these are the signs that they may go towards imposing more atrocities rules against those communities and atrocities against them. But we haven't seen any leniency, flexibility, and friendly relations that's coming from the Taliban to these minorities also.
Do you see any role for the Fatimiyoun in Afghanistan in terms of providing protection for Shia, or do you think that is not likely?
It's not, as I mentioned, at least for the time being, not likely. I mean, Taliban are very concerned about their recognition, especially from the West. And they want to present a united face, and they want to showcase that they are not allowing any other countries to have proxies inside Afghanistan, because that was in the Doha Agreement too. Right, a part of a Doha Agreement as well, not to turn Afghanistan into a territory and to a threat to other countries, especially the West. So I think looking all these specifics of their deals with the U.S. and overall their recognition, I don't see that's going to come up very soon. But again, for long term, we can't say anything at this stage.
Yeah. Fatima, let me come back to you. We have a very good question from Hala Vaziri on the interaction between Afghan refugees and Iranians. She asks if there are any groups or associations in Iran civil society that are advocating for more humane government policies toward refugees, trying to help Afghans integrate into Iranian society. And if so, if you could offer some examples of such groups and their activities.
Sure. Yes, actually they are. Just recently for a report I was writing, I found out that there are a number of NGOs, health service NGOs, for instance, that, one of the significant challenges for Afghan refugees in Iran is health services. Because, according to Iranian law, non-Iranian patients, in need of organ transplant, for instance, cannot receive organs free of charges. So, but there are a group of physicians who try to have established, medical centers to provide free services to Afghan refugees. A U.S hospital in Tehran is one of the centers that provide this kind of services to Afghan migrants. The other NGOs, Diyaran, for instance, is one of the most active NGOs, and Zanjire Umid is a chain of hope, a charity institute of orthopedic, heart medical services, it's called, I guess. They also offer services to Afghan children, but like many NGOs and the restrictions that exist upon them, they prioritize Iranian patients over Afghans. They are some NGOs, trying to help Afghan women who are the breadwinners, and they really suffered during the pandemic, the corona pandemic in Iran. They also involve, but you see, we have to note that there are the Iranian government generally doesn't view NGOs in a positive way, so they have to be cautious, and they would hesitate to take financial support from outside the country that could also provoke the government. And among Afghans, NGOs from Afghans, they would also face more restrictions. It's not an easy thing to do, to start an NGO and getting help from your countrymen out abroad is not as easy as we see in other countries. But yeah, there are some civil societies, some NGOs trying to help the the refugees, but it is overwhelming. We have to understand that, as I mentioned, everything happened in such a short time. And unfortunately, Iran, as no one expected that, there was no preparation for, to handle the crisis. So there are a number of refugees in Iran that there is no record or account of where they stay, what they do, and what is their need. Some hide, some because there is fear of being deported to Afghanistan. So it is a big challenge, if you want. Yeah.
Indeed. Borza, let me come back to you and let's talk about something we haven't raised, but you do mention in your paper. And there are perennial problems that Iran has had with Afghanistan. One of the biggest has always involved drugs. And certainly there were narcotics, opium that was coming out of the country for a long time. And a lot of Iranians blamed the supplies from Afghanistan for the very high addiction rates. Heroin addicts, opium addicts, and so on in Iran. I have read and seen some reports recently about methamphetamines now coming out of Afghanistan, because apparently it's a lot cheaper and easier to make meth than to deal with poppy and whatnot. And that the Taliban are, of course, taking a cut, and why not? It's a rare source of income. What's the situation with drugs now? Is there, again, any possibility for international cooperation on this, or is that not likely?
Well, in the past, Iran has, asked for international help on this issue. It has sought to gain international sympathy for the drug epidemic, really an opioid epidemic in Iran that is afflicting many people of different classes and so on. As you pointed out, there are many indications that it's not just the old school, not just opium anymore. That is sort of these opium patties that you can get at markets you used to be able to get them in open air markets in Pakistan. They would just be selling them in the autonomous zone there when that was still a lawless area. Now you get like refined products. So someone is setting up laboratories in Afghanistan. You're getting refined, you're getting heroin, which requires refinement, and you're getting like pills and crystal meth. So there's this possibility that Afghanistan is turning into sort of a narcotics hub, where this traditional business of raising poppies, cultivating the poppies, making the poppy patties, and just exporting them and so on, is now being expanded to include, other kinds of more synthetic, refined products and so on. That is not good for Iran. It is already dealing with this drug problem. On the other hand, it's Iran's client and partner, Syria, that is contributing to the drug. So it's hard to take their claims seriously, because it's Iran's partner and client, Syria, which is, massively contributing to the distribution of various types of narcotics throughout the Arab world. In terms of smuggling, there's no indication that the drugs are going down. Only indication is that the drugs are going up. Even in Turkey, there's flooded with narcotics, more and more popular. In general, I would say, and this is something that everyone should be working on and focusing on instead of playing their little power games, is that there's just an explosion of drug trafficking across Eurasia. I've noticed it over the last few years. It's just everywhere. People are dealing on the streets. Every single city that I go to, the cocaine is coming from Latin America. It's going through Albania. It's going into Turkey, and going back on the other way on the same routes. The heroin goes to Europe, and it's extraordinary, and it's expanding, and there's no sign of it stopping, and it's only increasing. It's an area for cooperation. On the other hand, Iran, as Fatima rightly noted, a lot of this kind of work is done by NGOs. What does Iran do? Arrest the NGOs, and bust them and put them in jail. You're working on the environment. You're trying to save the leopards. You go to jail. You're trying to, clean up a river. You go to jail. You take a little bit of money to help some addicts in the downtown Tehran, in the south of Tehran. Maybe you're going to go to jail. So who is going to, in that climate, as we know, much of this kind of work is done by NGOs and charities and so on. Who's going to want to work with Iran? Who's going to want to partner with Iran on this?
Yeah. Nilüfer, look, we haven't talked about, obviously the focus of this event is Iran and Afghanistan, but since you look at the region writ large as well, Taliban are not having an easy time with Pakistan either, are they? Tajikistan's been mentioned as well. There've been, my understanding is there've been attacks on the border with Pakistan. Afghans have been killed in some of the Pakistani attacks. What's the latest on that relationship? And why hasn't Pakistan recognized the Taliban government? Because, Pakistan has been their big supporter all along, right?
Yes, about the recognition that goes to that I think it is related to all the neighboring and regional countries. I see that also as a matter of reputation. That this country don't want. This country is Iran has relationship with the Western countries, of course. Pakistan has wants to have a close ties with the West, especially with the United States. The Central Asian countries, on the other hand, so it's all the regional alignment of these countries that is, they are not independent of for their decisions to make in relation to their ties with the Taliban, especially recognizing or endorsing Taliban. So they have to. They're looking at the West mostly and how their relationship will evolve if they will take such a step. Therefore, it's one about that. It's about the national interest of these countries that Pakistan, Iran, Central Asian countries all come under this whole framework of national interest. And they are looking at that as the major, where Taliban will go in terms of their reputation internationally and how they align themselves with Taliban will impact their relationship with the West in the long term or in short term, because all these countries have economic ties with the West and other broader regional countries. So they don't want to really jeopardize all those relationships because of their relationship with Taliban. So they're all the regional dynamics that goes back to the issue of recognition. On the other hand, there is a reputation too, of course, that because the Taliban are well known and they are also notorious for the violation of rights, of human rights, women's rights, freedom of speech, and name it, all this rights-based issue. So they don't want to come under that umbrella of endorsing a regime which is against the normal human rights of its own population. So that's another issue that I see. But again, there has been very close relationship between these countries and among these countries and the Taliban from last 8-9 months. Now, in relation to Pakistan, yes, Imran Khan government was very supportive of the Taliban, actually lobbying at the international stage for the recognition of the Taliban. And even at the end of Imran Khan's government, there has been those border crises that emerged, created tension between the two countries. And there were a number of other issues, but especially the border crisis between the two countries that Taliban tried to, and also the issue with TTP, by the way. There were two issues that created tension between at the end of the Imran Khan government and the Taliban. And now it is not a good relationship at this particular time. The relationship is shaky, but again, Pakistan is still considered a shelter for the Taliban, and Taliban consider Pakistan as a shelter for themselves, and that is there. That's still there. So there's the strategic depth of Pakistan make them to have a close ties with the Taliban because of its relationship with India, because of its economic interest in Central Asia, because of its ties with China. So there are all other elements that make Pakistan to have close ties with the Taliban, and they will have that close relationship in at least near future going forward. They try to what I see based on the situation going on. Pakistan tried to convince the Taliban for an inclusive government. That's why there has been recent meetings of other factions other than Taliban, other political factions. There was a meeting of them in Islamabad. So it seemed that Pakistan is working now with the other political factions in Afghanistan and the Taliban to bring them together and create a kind of an inclusive government, which doesn't seem very possible looking at the division between the Taliban in terms of their interest and ideology. But Taliban is trying to do that. Overall, Pakistan sees Taliban again as its own implementer of strategic depth in the region, and therefore will try to, even if the relationship goes shaky, zigzag movement for a while, but try to build the relationship by cooperating with them, providing them assistance, and also again helping them and reaching the recognition and coming closer to the recognition.
So who will be first to finally recognize this government? We also haven't mentioned Qatar, which of course played quite a role in terms of hosting the talks, the peace talks, and then in helping the United States evacuate people from Afghanistan. They haven't formally recognized the government either, even though they do have an embassy there.
They haven't. But I mean, based on what I have been following closely, the relationships of the regional countries with the Taliban, Russia, China, Iran. I would see them because of the diplomatic ties that they had with the Taliban leadership so far. Pakistan's, of course, they are the friends for the Taliban, even if there will be some back clashes going on, but still they see themselves as friends to implement Pakistan's strategic depth. For the long term. But I see these countries are having, at least based on last few months of the relationship, are having closer ties with the Taliban from last 7-8 months.
Okay, let me go and sort of start all around again, give everybody an opportunity to say things perhaps that they had wanted to say and didn't, and also raise the question of U.S. policy now. Should the U.S. release these frozen assets? Would the money actually get to needy Afghans, or would it just go into the pockets of corrupt people? Is there really a possibility for some counterterrorism cooperation, even tacit, with Afghanistan's neighbors in terms of dealing with these even more severe threats that have been mentioned? I hadn't realized that Al-Qaeda was coming back. I'd be curious to know where they are and how many of them they are and what their intentions are. And of course, ISIS-K, what are they up to now? What are their goals? Do they threaten the West? Do they threaten the United States? Is there, much attention being paid now by U.S. officials to the threats potentially emanating from Afghanistan again? So, Burzi, let me start with you.
I mean, one of the things that I've been, as you know, Barbara, very well, what one former U.S. official told me he described as shiny ball syndrome, whereby, Washington is just sort of focused on, even though it has all these different branches and different departments. So, for example, the person I was talking to it was about Iran sanctions. It's like, but you wouldn't believe it. Now the pressure is on us not to deal with Iran sanctions, but to deal with the way that we can, look at Iran sanctions through the prism of Russia, Ukraine. So that's the shiny ball right now that everyone is focused on, and the bandwidth is all moving towards that. And no, there's not enough attention being paid to the security threats in Afghanistan. Even the people whose job it is to do that are distracted or ignored or kind of marginalized at this point on a policy level and a decision-making level. There is a lot of room for cooperation on security and humanitarian grounds that is not being taken advantage of. There's a lot of, as we put it in the story, as far as Iran and the U.S. and other countries go, their interests tend to diverge every single other place in the region, in the Southwest Asia, whereas in Afghanistan they tend to mesh. No one is, that far apart around the region as to what they want in Afghanistan, what they wish for Afghanistan. On that security front, it should be noted that, although ISIS-K has been performing these attacks and terrorizing the Shia community in Afghanistan, it was performing the same attacks and terrorizing the Shia community under the Ashraf Ghani government as well. And I don't think it's even changed in terms of the pace. There's not even any suggestion that there's been increase in attacks. It's just that the political context has changed, and now there's someone to blame, a government that doesn't include any Shia Hazara. Again, something that emphasizes that everyone has sort of the same aims. Even the Taliban, they don't want to seem like things are out of control. Along with the Iranians and the Americans and so on. So I think there is a lot of room for cooperation. Iran has been strongly arguing to unfreeze the assets of the that are owed to the Afghan government. I think more for its own selfish purposes. They don't want Afghan people to go hungry because they don't want the Afghan people to come to Iran. And so I think that they're actually, and I think there's also a principle of we're against sanctions in general. They are against the Iranian sanctions, they're against the Russian sanctions, and so on and so forth. So I think there's that as well. There's a principle involved as well, but it's very much for their own self-interest to see some modicum of stability in that country. And food security is one of the main components of stability. So yeah, I think there's if there's one thing that I would like to get across, and that the paper tried to get across, is that there's a easy, low-hanging fruit to be plucked here in a very low-cost way. The U.S., Iran, etc., can see some of their modest goals in Afghanistan pursued without giving up on any principles and without expending a lot of diplomatic capital.
Thank you. Fatima, if you could talk about the frozen assets, what's your view of that? We are sanctions crazy in the United States now. That is for sure. I can understand the aversion to the Taliban and perhaps holding out for them to treat women better or appoint some minorities to the cabinet, something like that. But it's been months and months, and things are getting worse, not better. So should we continue to freeze this money?
Let me just, I agree with fully with Borzu and Nilufar on this. You cannot exclude Afghan people from international help, from their own asset, from from any possibility that they are taking care of them, but at least they are starvation. The situation is really is becoming irreversible tragedy somehow. In the beginning, I was hoping that international organizations would get more active in Afghanistan. Right now, everything, all attention has been away from Afghanistan. I believe that's their money, and you should not tie this money and this asset with Taliban doing this and that. I know everything is very important. I know that, securing the interests of religious and minority communities is very important. I know girls' education is extremely important, but we should be able to disconnect all this together. If you're waiting for Taliban to become a democratic government, then recognize them and send them money. You can't wait forever, and that will not happen. I mean, the danger is, I believe, that the more you press the Afghan government, and the more you isolate them, and the more restrictions you put upon them, they will left with no choice but to invite and getting more involved with the foreign terrorist groups, those with the those who have financial means to bring to the country, like it was with Al Qaeda, and that would also create a ground for civil war. And if that happens, we can't forget about everything that was achieved, if there was anything in Afghanistan. I pray that somebody is paying attention to what's going on in Afghanistan. I mean, I know, that's it.
Yeah,
I always get emotional when I talk about that.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you, and I know you've been to that country very, very often. Nilüfer, you get the last word. Should we increase the assets? Should we give up on putting conditions that clearly are difficult for the Taliban to meet? Is there a possibility for more international cooperation to improve the lot of Afghans and perhaps nudge the Taliban in a good direction?
Well, I think the first and the foremost that the humanitarian assistance shouldn't be conditional. The humanitarian assistance shouldn't be political, because that's going, and with the condition that should go directly to the people. I mean, to be honest, we are not sure about the Taliban at this point, and we cannot trust them. It's difficult to trust them, at least from last 8 months of their governance. It's really difficult to trust Taliban at this point. So, but the money should go directly to the people. People should be able to receive the assistance. And there is a literature, there's a security literature that I want to quote here, that talks that poverty leads to instability and insecurity. I think that, as Fatima also highlighted, and that's a fair, that with more poverty we will have an insecure Afghanistan, and more people will join insurgency and terrorist groups just to bring bread at their table. So that's a fair, that is concerning for Afghanistan, for the region. It should be a concerning point. So yes, poverty plays a strong role in fueling the instability, and also creating and giving birth to new insurgent or terrorist groups in the country. So therefore, yes, there is need for more cooperation, coordination among the international community to assist the needy, and to provide the basic needs to the people. And that, again, as I mentioned, UN can play a role. International community aid agencies could play a role. There hasn't been so much of restrictions at this point on these entities to work around the country and provide assistance to the people. So it's a good point, I think. NGOs, Afghan-led NGOs should be supported and provide them with the resources in order to spread the resources throughout the country. And the people, community centers around the country, they should be provided resources as well, in order to at least tackle the humanitarian crisis at this particular time. And I think, again, international community could play a major role, especially the UN, in this crisis in Afghanistan.
And should the assets be unfrozen, given to the UN? I mean,
Well, that is a very technical economic question, to be honest. I'm not an economic expert, and I don't want to jump in there. And I don't know how the details would work here, the specification. So I would like to skip this part.
All right. Well, I think we've covered hopefully most, if not all, of the situation. I'm very, very pleased that that we've had a chance now to deal with this question and to showcase the concerns that the entire international community has and should have about Afghanistan. I would like to believe, as an American who's lived through the last 2 decades, that not everything the United States did in that country went to waste. Certainly there was a generation or two that was educated in part because the United States went in and its allies went in. And I also want to just express my admiration for the Afghan people, and especially for the women of Afghanistan, who are continuing to try to educate girls and young women in the country. And I believe that if Afghanistan sees Iran as some kind of model, then they should be wary, because the Iranian society has changed enormously over the last 40 years, and Iranian women are not to be trifled with. So perhaps the same kind of dynamic will also begin to take place in Afghanistan as well. Anyway, I really want to thank my speakers. Borzu, thank you very much for writing this paper. I hope everyone will read it. I hope people in the US government will read it, and in the Iranian government, and perhaps take some ideas away from it on how we can actually help each other for a change. So with that, thank you all for spending time with us, and please come back again. We're going to have an event in June on clashing narratives about the US and Iran. There's a very fascinating new book that has come out about our historical narratives and how they make it difficult for us to talk to each other. So thank you again, and be well.
Barbara, can I announce our program if you
yes, please. Yes, go for it.
Yes, just for our audience, we will have another panel at the end of this month, 31st of May, focusing on the security crisis, more specific on the emerging security crisis in Afghanistan, that the region will be impacted by it as well. So that would be a great touch on all the security elements and dynamics in the country and region. Thank you.
Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your day.